The click of handcuffs echoed through Riverside Park. Marcus Davis, a respected FBI agent, found himself arrested for the crime of reading while black. Little did Officer Harkens know, his actions that day would not only end his career, but spark a nationwide conversation on racial profiling. How did this misguided arrest become a catalyst for change? Marcus Davis settled into the worn wooden bench, his fingers tracing the spine of his weathered copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees of Riverside Park, casting dappled shadows across the pages. He took a deep breath, savoring the crisp autumn air and the rare moment of tranquility in his otherwise hectic life as an FBI agent. Across the park, Officer Brian Harkens patrolled the winding paths, his eyes scanning the area with practiced efficiency. His gaze landed on Marcus, and a frown creased his brow. Something about the solitary black man on the bench didn't sit right with him. Brian's mind raced with assumptions, each one building on the last. Why was he alone? What was he reading? Was he casing the area for a potential crime? Brian's hand instinctively moved to rest on his holster as he approached Marcus. His shoulders tensed, and his stride became more purposeful. "Excuse me, sir," he called out, his voice sharp and authoritative. "What are you doing here?" Marcus looked up from his book, surprise flickering across his face before settling into a calm, neutral expression. "Just reading, officer," he replied, holding up the novel. "Is there a problem?" Brian's eyes narrowed, unconvinced by the simple explanation. "I'm going to need to see some identification," he demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. His body language grew more aggressive, looming over Marcus as he waited for compliance. The atmosphere in the park shifted, the peaceful afternoon giving way to a palpable tension. A few passers-by slowed their pace, curious about the confrontation unfolding before them. Marcus felt his heart rate quicken, but he kept his voice steady as he asked, "May I ask why you need to see my ID? Have I done something wrong?" Brian's jaw clenched, frustration mounting at what he perceived as defiance. "You're acting suspiciously," he stated, the words coming out more as an accusation than an explanation. "I have the authority to ask for identification from anyone in this park." Marcus took a deep breath, weighing his options. He knew his rights, but he also understood the potential danger of the situation. Slowly, he closed his book and set it beside him on the bench. "Officer," he began, his tone respectful but firm, "I don't believe I'm required to show identification unless I'm being lawfully detained or arrested. Am I free to go, or am I being detained?" Brian's face flushed with anger, his patience wearing thin. He leaned in closer, his voice low and threatening. "Listen here, buddy. You can either show me your ID right now, or I'll have to assume you've got something to hide. Your choice." As the confrontation escalated, a sense of unease settled over the park. Bystanders began to pull out their phones, some recording the interaction while others debated whether to intervene. Marcus remained outwardly calm, but his mind raced, considering the potential consequences of each possible action. The stage was set for a clash between an officer's misplaced suspicion and a citizen's constitutional rights. As Brian's hand moved towards his handcuffs, it was clear that this peaceful afternoon in the park was about to take a dramatic and unjust turn. As Brian's fingers closed around the cold metal of his handcuffs, a question hung in the air. How far would this officer go to satisfy his unfounded suspicions? The next few moments would test the limits of both men's resolve and reveal the true cost of unchecked prejudice. Marcus took a deep breath, his voice steady as he met Brian's gaze. "Officer, am I under arrest? If not, I'd like to leave." The simple question carried weight, challenging Brian's authority and the legality of his actions. Brian's jaw clenched, his frustration mounting. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, taking a step closer. "I told you, you're acting suspiciously. Why won't you just show me your ID?" The tension in the air thickened as Marcus remained calm, his hands visible at his sides. "With all due respect, officer, I haven't done anything wrong. Reading in a public park isn't suspicious behavior, and I'm not required to show ID unless I'm being lawfully detained." Brian's face flushed red, his patience wearing thin. He jabbed a finger towards Marcus's chest. "Listen here, I'm the one who decides what's suspicious. You're being uncooperative, and that's probable cause enough for me. Marcus fought to keep his composure, knowing the danger of the situation. He spoke clearly, loud enough for nearby parkgoers to hear. Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I'm exercising my constitutional rights. I haven't committed any crime, and there's no reasonable suspicion to detain me. As the confrontation escalated, people began to take notice. A young woman pulled out her phone, discreetly hitting record. An older man stepped closer, concern etched on his face. The weight of watchful eyes seemed to press down on Brian, but instead of calming him, it only fueled his anger. That's it, Brian snapped, reaching for his handcuffs. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. Marcus's heart raced, but he kept his voice level. Officer, please, you don't have probable cause for an arrest. This is a mistake that could have serious consequences. But Brian was beyond reasoning. As he roughly grabbed Marcus's arm, a chorus of protests erupted from the gathered onlookers. Phones were raised, capturing every moment of the unjust arrest. Marcus winced as the cuffs bit into his wrists, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warm autumn day. He looked around at the shocked faces of the bystanders, some calling out in anger, others frantically dialing their phones. You're making a mistake, Marcus said quietly as Brian began to lead him away. This isn't just about me. This kind of action erodes trust between law enforcement and the community. It perpetuates fear and resentment. Brian's grip tightened, but doubt flickered in his eyes. For a moment, the weight of his actions seemed to register, but he pushed the feeling aside. Save it for the station, he muttered, guiding Marcus towards his patrol car. As they walked, the park that had been a scene of tranquility just moments ago now buzzed with tension and outrage. The injustice of the situation hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the ongoing struggle against racial profiling and unchecked authority. The patrol car pulled away from the park, leaving behind a stunned crowd and a cloud of outrage. Brian gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. He'd made arrests before, but something about this one felt different. Little did he know, the next few minutes would force him to confront a truth that would shatter everything he thought he knew about law enforcement and racial bias. Marcus winced as the handcuffs dug into his wrists, the cold metal a stark reminder of the injustice unfolding. He took a deep breath, fighting to maintain his composure, despite the humiliation coursing through him. The weight of decades of systemic racism pressed down on his shoulders, threatening to crush his spirit. But Marcus knew he had to stay calm, to think clearly through the fog of anger and frustration. Outside the car, the crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Shocked gasps and cries of outrage filled the air as bystanders pulled out their phones, determined to document the unjust arrest. A young woman's voice rose above the din, her words sharp with indignation. "This is wrong!" He didn't do anything. Brian's eyes darted nervously to the rearview mirror, taking in the sea of raised phones and angry faces. A flicker of doubt crossed his face as he realized the magnitude of attention his actions had attracted. He swallowed hard, his earlier confidence wavering in the face of public scrutiny. In the back seat, Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. When he opened them, his gaze met Brian's in the mirror. "Officer," he said, his voice steady and controlled, "I want you to understand the gravity of what you're doing. This isn't just about me. Your actions today have consequences that reach far beyond this moment." Brian's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Marcus continued, his words measured and deliberate. "I've spent my career in law enforcement, working to build trust between the police and the communities they serve. What you're doing right now, it's eroding that trust piece by piece." A flicker of surprise crossed Brian's face at the mention of Marcus's career. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, uncertainty creeping into his expression. The car fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the crackle of the police radio. As they neared the precinct, Marcus felt a strange calm settle over him. He knew that soon the truth would come to light, but he also understood that this incident was bigger than just one wrongful arrest. It was a stark illustration of the biases that still plague law enforcement, the assumptions that could turn a peaceful afternoon into a life-altering confrontation. The patrol car pulled into the station parking lot, the familiar blue and red lights of other police vehicles reflecting off its windshield. Brian cut the engine, his hand hovering over the door handle. For a moment, he hesitated, as if sensing the shift in power that was about to occur. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and moved to open the back door. As Marcus was led towards the precinct entrance, he caught sight of a familiar face through the glass doors. A glimmer of recognition passed between them, and Marcus knew that the next few minutes would change everything. The truth was about to come out, and with it, the beginning of a long overdue reckoning. Officer Brian Harkens thought he knew exactly how this arrest would play out. He couldn't have been more wrong. As they approached the station, the balance of power was about to shift dramatically, leaving both men forever changed by what was about to unfold. The patrol car glided through the streets, its interior thick with tension. Marcus sat straight backed in the rear, his eyes fixed on Brian's reflection in the rearview mirror. The handcuffs bit into his wrists, a constant reminder of the injustice unfolding. Brian's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched as he navigated the familiar route to the precinct. "Officer Harkens," Marcus began, his voice calm and measured, "I'd like to understand your thought process. What specific behaviors led you to believe I was acting suspiciously?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Brian's eyes darted to the mirror, meeting Marcus's steady gaze. He swallowed hard, his mind racing to formulate a response that wouldn't further incriminate him. You seemed out of place," he stammered, the words sounding weak even to his own ears. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression neutral. "And reading a book in a public park constitutes being out of place?" The question was rhetorical, highlighting the absurdity of the situation. As they drove, Brian's confidence began to crumble. Each of Marcus's carefully worded questions chipped away at the facade of authority he had constructed. The cognitive dissonance grew, forcing Brian to confront the uncomfortable truth that his actions were based on nothing more than unfounded assumptions and prejudice. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice low but clear. "Did you consider the long-term consequences of your actions today? Not just for me, but for community trust in law enforcement?" The question struck at the heart of Brian's professional ethics, forcing him to grapple with the broader implications of his choices. Brian's mind raced, trying to justify his decisions. But with each passing moment, the weight of his mistake pressed down on him. He found himself second-guessing every interaction, every assumption that had led to this point. The uneasy feeling in his gut grew stronger as they neared the precinct. As the station came into view, Marcus's demeanor shifted subtly. A quiet confidence radiated from him, unsettling Brian even further. The power dynamic had shifted, though Brian couldn't quite understand why. He felt as though he was walking into a trap of his own making, each step bringing him closer to a reckoning he wasn't prepared to face. The patrol car pulled into the station parking lot, the familiar surroundings doing little to calm Brian's growing anxiety. He cut the engine, his hand hovering over the door handle as he took a deep breath. For a moment, he considered the possibility that he had made a grave error in judgment. But pride and stubbornness pushed the thought aside as he stepped out of the car. As Brian moved to open the rear door, he caught sight of a flicker of recognition on the face of an officer entering the precinct. The seed of doubt that had been planted during the drive began to sprout, sending tendrils of unease through his mind. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. With a sense of foreboding, Brian led Marcus toward the station doors. Little did he know, the next few minutes would shatter his world and force him to confront the consequences of his actions in ways he never could have imagined. The precinct doors swung open, and the bustling station fell into an eerie hush. All eyes turned to Marcus, but not for the reason Brian expected. What was about to unfold would leave the overconfident officer wishing he could melt into the floor. Brian led Marcus towards the booking desk, his grip on the handcuffed man's arm loosening with each step. The usual cacophony of ringing phones, shuffling papers, and overlapping conversations faded to a low murmur, as officers and staff alike took notice of the unusual pair. Officer Jenkins looked up from his paperwork, his practiced greeting dying on his lips as he recognized the man in handcuffs. His eyes widened, darting between Marcus and Brian with growing alarm. Officer Harkens, Jenkins stammered, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Can I speak with you for a moment? Brian's brow furrowed, suspicion creeping into his expression. What's the problem, Jenkins? I'm just bringing in a suspect for processing. Jenkins hesitated, his gaze fixed on Marcus. Sir, he addressed the handcuffed man directly. Are you Agent Marcus Davis? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Brian's head snapped towards Marcus, confusion and disbelief warring on his face. Marcus nodded, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the growing tension around him. Yes, I am, he replied, his voice steady and authoritative despite the handcuffs. I'd show you my credentials, but... He shrugged, the metal links clinking softly. The color drained from Brian's face as the full weight of his mistake crashed down upon him. Jenkins quickly explained, Officer Harkens, Agent Davis is a highly respected FBI agent. He's been instrumental in several major cases and has worked closely with our department on numerous occasions. As the truth sank in, the atmosphere in the precinct shifted palpably. Officers who had been watching from a distance now drew closer, murmuring among themselves. Some looked at Brian with open disapproval, while others seemed unsure how to react to the unfolding situation. Brian's hands shook as he fumbled with the handcuff keys, his earlier confidence evaporating like mist in the morning sun. I'm so sorry, Agent Davis, he mumbled, unable to meet Marcus's eyes as he removed the restraints. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Marcus rubbed his wrists, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp as he surveyed the room. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically, and everyone present could feel it. Officer Harkens, he said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the hushed precinct, I think we need to have a serious discussion about what transpired today. As if on cue, a door at the far end of the room opened, and Captain Laura Bennett emerged. Her stern gaze swept over the scene, taking in the shell-shocked Brian, the newly freed Marcus, and the crowd of onlooking officers. Agent Davis, she called out, her voice cutting through the tension. I was just informed of the situation. Please join me in my office. She turned her attention to Brian, her expression hardening. Officer Harkens, you too. We have much to discuss. As Marcus and Brian followed Captain Bennett, the precinct erupted into a flurry of whispers and meaningful glances. The incident that had begun in Riverside Park was far from over. In fact, it was clear to everyone present that the real reckoning was only just beginning. Captain Bennett's office had seen its share of tense conversations, but none quite like this. As Brian stepped inside, his mind raced through possible outcomes. Would his badge be stripped away? Or would this become a catalyst for change that extended far beyond one officer's mistake? The precinct buzzed with a mixture of shock and anticipation as Captain Laura Bennett strode out of her office. Her piercing gaze swept across the room, taking in the scene before her. Officers shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny, their conversations dying down to hushed whispers. Agent Davis, Bennett called out, her voice carrying a mix of respect and concern. I apologize for this incident. Please join me in my office. She turned to Brian, her expression hardening. Officer Harkens, you too. Now. As Brian followed Bennett into her office, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions bearing down on him. Marcus, on the other hand, stood tall, his demeanor calm and professional as he nodded to the other officers. Inside the office, Brian's nervousness was palpable. He fidgeted in his seat, unable to meet Bennett's stern gaze. Marcus sat composed, his hands folded neatly on his lap, a stark contrast to Brian's agitation. Officer Harkens, Bennett began, her voice low and controlled. Explain to me exactly what happened today. As Brian stumbled through his account, his voice wavering, Marcus remained silent, his eyes never leaving Bennett's face. The captain's expression grew increasingly grave with each passing moment. Outside, the precinct was a hive of conflicting emotions. Some officers huddled in small groups, discussing the incident in hushed tones. Others cast furtive glances at the captain's closed door, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. Sergeant Rodriguez approached Marcus as he waited, offering a cup of coffee and an apologetic smile. Agent Davis, I can't express how sorry we are about this situation. It's It's not reflective of our entire department. Marcus accepted the coffee with a nod. I understand, Sergeant. But this incident highlights a larger issue that needs addressing. It's not just about one officer's actions, but about the systemic biases that allow such situations to occur. As Marcus spoke, a small crowd of officers gathered around him, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. The agent's words carried weight, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about their profession. Inside the office, the tension reached a breaking point. Bennett's voice, though muffled, carried enough for those nearest to hear snippets of her reprimand. Unacceptable, damage to community relations, serious consequences. After what seemed like an eternity, the office door opened. Captain Bennett emerged first, her face a mask of professional composure. Brian followed, his eyes red-rimmed and downcast. Officer Harkens is suspended pending a full investigation, Bennett announced, her voice leaving no room for argument. Agent Davis, I'd like to discuss this further, if you have a moment. As Brian was escorted to clear out his locker, the reality of the situation sank in for everyone present. This wasn't just about one arrest gone wrong. It was a moment that would force the entire precinct to reevaluate its practices and confront the deep-rooted issues of racial bias in law enforcement. The incident in Riverside Park had set in motion a chain of events that would challenge the status quo and demand real, lasting change. As Marcus followed Captain Bennett back into her office, the weight of the work ahead settled over the precinct like a heavy cloud. In the wake of the Riverside Park incident, a new player entered the scene. Detective Harper, known for his uncompromising pursuit of justice, took center stage in the internal investigation. What would his methodical approach uncover about the deep-rooted issues plaguing the department? Detective James Harper sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of witness statements and police reports. His piercing blue eyes scanned the documents, searching for inconsistencies and hidden truths. With over 2 decades of experience in internal affairs, Harper had seen his fair share of misconduct cases, but this one felt different. He began by reviewing the body cam footage from Officer Brian Harkens' encounter with Marcus Davis. The video played on his computer screen, revealing the tense interaction in stark detail. Harper's brow furrowed as he watched Harkens approach Davis without provocation, his tone aggressive from the start. Unacceptable, Harper muttered, pausing the footage to jot down notes. He couldn't ignore the growing knot in his stomach as he observed Harkens' body language and listened to his increasingly hostile commands. Over the next few days, Harper conducted a series of interviews with witnesses from the park. Each account painted a consistent picture of an officer overstepping his bounds, driven by unfounded suspicion. One young woman's testimony stood out, her voice shaking as she recounted how Harkens had ignored Davis's calm explanations. As the investigation progressed, the evidence against Harkens mounted. Harper meticulously cross-referenced witness statements with the body cam footage, building a comprehensive timeline of events. The more he dug, the clearer it became that Harkens' actions were not just a momentary lapse in judgment, but indicative of a deeper problem. Meanwhile, Brian Harkens sat at home, suspended from duty and grappling with the gravity of his actions. Each day brought new waves of shame and regret as he reflected on the incident. The realization that his career might be over was slowly sinking in, along with the understanding that he had become part of a larger, systemic issue. Back at the precinct, Harper prepared to present his findings to Captain Bennett. He organized his notes and evidence, knowing that his conclusions would have far-reaching implications for the department. The tension in his office was palpable as he reviewed his report one last time. Finally, Harper stood before Captain Bennett, his expression grave. After a thorough investigation, he began, his voice steady, I've concluded that Officer Harkens' actions were unjustified and racially motivated. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of bias that led to the wrongful arrest of Agent Davis. Bennett listened intently, her face a mask of professional composure. As Harper detailed his findings, she knew that the department was at a crossroads. This incident would force them to confront the uncomfortable truth about racial bias within their ranks and demand significant changes in training and accountability. As the meeting concluded, Harper felt a mix of satisfaction and unease. He had done his job, uncovering the truth and holding an officer accountable. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, transforming these findings into meaningful reform that would prevent similar incidents in the future. The precinct buzzed with anticipation as word of Harper's conclusion spread. Officers exchanged worried glances, wondering how this would affect their day-to-day operations. It was clear that the department's response to this incident would shape its future and its relationship with the community for years to come. Captain Laura Bennett took a deep breath, her hand resting on the doorknob of the conference room. Beyond this threshold lay a microcosm of the larger societal struggle playing out in their city. Could she find a way to unite her officers and set a new course for justice? As Bennett pushed open the door, the low murmur of conversation abruptly ceased. The room was packed with senior officers, their faces a mix of apprehension and curiosity. She strode to the front, her posture rigid, exuding an air of authority that demanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bennett began, her voice steady and clear, "we're here to address a serious incident that occurred in Riverside Park." She outlined the details of Marcus Davis's wrongful arrest, her words punctuated by sharp intakes of breath and shifting in seats. As Bennett spoke, the atmosphere in the room grew tenser. Some officers exchanged worried glances, while others sat with arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. When she finished her summary, a heavy silence fell over the room. Sergeant Miller was the first to break it. "With all due respect, Captain," he said, leaning forward, "Harkens is a good cop. We've all had to make split-second decisions in the field. Are we really going to crucify him for one mistake?" His words sparked a heated debate. Officer Chen shot back, her voice tight with anger. "A mistake? He arrested a man for reading a book. How can we expect the community to trust us when we're acting on baseless suspicions?" The room erupted into a cacophony of arguments. Bennett's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the chaos, her jaw clenching as she fought to maintain control. "Enough!" she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent once more. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident," Bennett continued, her tone measured but firm. "This is about addressing the systemic biases that allowed it to happen in the first place." She moved to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. "I want solutions," she said, turning to face her team. "How do we prevent this from happening again? How do we rebuild trust with our community?" The discussion that followed was tense but productive. Ideas flew back and forth. Increased de-escalation training, community outreach programs, stricter accountability measures. Bennett jotted down each suggestion, her mind already formulating a plan of action. As the meeting drew to a close, Bennett could feel the weight of expectation on her shoulders. Her officers looked to her, waiting for her decision on Harkens' fate. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping across the room. "After careful consideration and a thorough investigation, I've made my decision," she announced. "Officer Brian Harkens' employment with this department is terminated, effective immediately." A collective gasp filled the room, followed by a buzz of whispered conversations. Bennett raised her hand for silence. "This decision wasn't made lightly," she continued, "but we cannot tolerate actions that erode public trust and perpetuate racial bias. It's time for real change, and it starts here, with us." As the officers filed out of the room, the gravity of the situation hung heavy in the air. They all knew that this was just the beginning. The incident in Riverside Park had exposed deep-rooted issues that couldn't be solved overnight. Bennett remained in the conference room, staring at the whiteboard filled with ideas and action items. The road ahead would be challenging, but she was determined to lead her department towards a more just and equitable future. The real work was just beginning. The whiteboard in Captain Bennett's office held a roadmap for change, but implementing it would require more than just her determination. Across town, Marcus Davis sat at his kitchen table, a career-altering decision weighing heavily on his mind. The intersection of their paths would set in motion a series of events that neither could have anticipated. Marcus arrived at the precinct, his shoulders set with purpose. He nodded to the officers he passed, noting the mix of respect and wariness in their eyes. Captain Bennett welcomed him into her office, the tension in her posture betraying the challenges she faced. "Thank you for coming, Agent Davis," Bennett said, gesturing to a chair. "Your insights could be invaluable as we move forward." Marcus leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Captain, What happened to me isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem that needs addressing. For the next hour, Marcus outlined his vision for reform. He proposed comprehensive bias training programs, increased community engagement initiatives, and stricter accountability measures for officers. Bennett listened intently, jotting notes and asking pointed questions. As they delved into the details, the enormity of the task became clear. Implementing such sweeping changes would face resistance from within the department. Some officers, set in their ways, would balk at the increased scrutiny and additional training requirements. We can't force change overnight, Marcus acknowledged, but we can start laying the groundwork for a more just and equitable police force. Bennett nodded, her expression a mix of determination and concern. I agree, but we'll need to tread carefully. Some officers are already on edge about the fallout from your arrest. As if on cue, a commotion erupted outside the office. Sergeant Miller's voice carried through the door, his tone sharp with frustration. Another sensitivity training? What's next? Holding hands and singing Kumbaya with suspects. Marcus and Bennett exchanged a look, the challenge ahead of them crystallizing in that moment. They knew that changing ingrained attitudes and behaviors would be an uphill battle. Over the next few weeks, Marcus worked closely with Bennett to develop a comprehensive reform plan. They pored over successful initiatives from other cities, adapting strategies to fit their department's unique needs. Each step forward was met with both enthusiasm and resistance. As the day of the first bias training session approached, tension in the precinct reached a fever pitch. Officers huddled in small groups, their whispered conversations a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Some embraced the opportunity for growth, while others viewed it as an unnecessary challenge to their authority. The training room buzzed with nervous energy as officers filed in, their expressions ranging from open interest to barely concealed skepticism. Marcus stood at the front, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the unease around him. Good morning, he began, his voice steady and clear. Today we start a journey towards becoming better officers and building stronger community relationships. It won't be easy, but it's necessary. As Marcus launched into the training, the room's atmosphere slowly shifted. Some officers leaned forward, engaged by the real-world scenarios and frank discussions. Others sat back, arms crossed, their resistance palpable. But as the session progressed, even the most skeptical began to participate, if reluctantly. The first round of training ended with mixed reactions, but it was a start. As officers filed out, their conversations were animated, some questioning long-held beliefs while others defended their current practices. Marcus watched them go, knowing that true change would take time and persistence. Outside the precinct, word of the department's reform efforts began to spread. The community's response would be the true test of their commitment to change. The community hall buzzed with anticipation as residents filed in, their faces a mix of hope and skepticism. The air felt thick with tension, a palpable reminder of the incident that had brought them all together. At the front of the room, Captain Bennett and Marcus Davis stood side by side, their postures reflecting a united front against the challenges ahead. As the meeting began, voices rose and fell in a cacophony of concerns. An older woman, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, stood up, her voice quavering with emotion. How can we trust that anything will really change? We've heard promises before, but nothing ever comes of them. Marcus stepped forward, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere. I understand your frustration, he said, his voice steady and clear. That's why we're not just making promises, we're taking concrete action. He outlined the new training programs and accountability measures. His words met with a mixture of nods and skeptical murmurs. As he spoke, a young man in the back raised his hand, his face etched with doubt. But who's going to make sure these changes stick? How do we know this isn't just a PR stunt? Captain Bennett took the microphone, her eyes scanning the crowd. That's a valid concern, she acknowledged, which is why we're proposing the formation of a civilian oversight committee. We want the community to be directly involved in holding us accountable. The announcement sent a ripple through the audience. Some leaned forward, intrigued by the idea, while others crossed their arms, their expressions guarded. A local community organizer stood up, her voice carrying across the room. And who would be on this committee? How would they be chosen? For the next hour, Marcus and Bennett fielded questions, their responses measured and thoughtful. They detailed plans for a diverse committee, selected through a transparent process involving both the department and community leaders. As the meeting progressed, the initial hostility began to soften, replaced by cautious optimism. In the weeks that followed, the Oversight Committee took shape. Community members from various backgrounds came together, their determination to create lasting change evident in every meeting. They pored over police reports, analyzed data, and worked closely with the department to implement new policies. The entire city seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if these efforts would bear fruit. Neighborhood watch groups reported increased engagement with local officers. Community events saw higher turnout from both residents and police, fostering dialogue and understanding. 3 months after the incident in Riverside Park, the first set of data was released. The numbers showed a marked decrease in racially motivated stops and arrests. While some remained skeptical, citing the short time frame, others saw it as a promising start. At a follow-up town hall, Marcus stood before the community once again. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice carrying a note of cautious optimism. "We have a long way to go, but these early results show that change is possible when we work together." As the meeting adjourned, the atmosphere was noticeably different from that first tense gathering. Residents lingered, engaged in animated discussions with officers and committee members. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, there was a sense that real progress might be within reach. Brian stared at the flyer in his hand, his heart racing as he approached the community center. Could a support group for former officers really help him face the demons of his past? The weight of his actions hung heavy on Brian's shoulders as he pushed open the door. The room was filled with a mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces, all wearing the same look of resignation and uncertainty. He took a seat in the back, hoping to blend into the background. As the meeting began, Brian listened to stories that echoed his own experiences. Officers who had made mistakes, crossed lines they never thought they would. The guilt and shame in their voices resonated with him, but so did the defensiveness. He found himself nodding along as one man insisted he was just doing his job, that the world didn't understand the pressures they faced. But as the weeks went by, something began to shift in Brian. He started to see the patterns in their stories, the biases that had shaped their actions. He remembered the look in Marcus Davis's eyes as he'd slapped on the handcuffs, the mix of anger and resignation that spoke of a lifetime of similar encounters. Determined to understand, Brian threw himself into research. He pored over books on systemic racism, attended lectures, and engaged in difficult conversations with people of color. Each new piece of information was like a puzzle piece clicking into place, revealing the bigger picture of injustice he'd been blind to for so long. One night, as Brian sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by open books and scribbled notes, the full weight of his actions hit him. He thought of all the lives he might have impacted over the years, all the people he'd treated with suspicion simply because of the color of their skin. The realization left him breathless, his hands shaking as he pushed away from the table. In the following days, Brian grappled with how to make amends. He knew there was no easy fix, no way to undo the harm he'd caused. But as he continued to attend the support group, he began to see a path forward. It started small. Brian shared his story with the group, laying bare his mistakes and the painful process of confronting his biases. The room fell silent as he spoke, the weight of his words hanging in the air. When he finished, several others nodded in recognition, some with tears in their eyes. Encouraged by the response, Brian decided to take his story further. He reached out to the police academy, offering to speak to new recruits about the dangers of unchecked bias. His hands shook as he dialed the number, but his voice was steady as he explained his purpose. To his surprise, the academy accepted his offer. As Brian prepared for his first presentation, he felt a mix of nervousness and determination. He knew his words alone couldn't solve the deep-rooted problems in law enforcement. But if he could reach even one officer, make them think twice before acting on unfounded suspicions, it would be worth it. As Brian stood before the first group of recruits, their young faces looking up at him with a mix of curiosity and wariness, he took a deep breath. He thought of Marcus Davis, of all the nameless individuals who had suffered because of attitudes like his former self. Then he began to speak, his voice growing stronger with each word, determined to be part of the change he now knew was so desperately needed. 12 months can feel like an eternity or the blink of an eye. For the officers of the 12th precinct, it was both. As they assembled to mark a year of reform, the air was thick with anticipation. What would the cold, hard numbers reveal about their progress? And more importantly, would the community believe in their transformation? Captain Laura Bennett stood at the podium, her shoulders squared as she faced the crowd gathered in the community center. Officers in pressed uniforms sat alongside community members, their faces a mix of hope and lingering skepticism. Bennett cleared her throat, her voice steady as she began. 1 year ago, an incident in Riverside Park forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our department. Today, we're here to share the results of our efforts to address those issues head-on. She gestured to a screen behind her, where a series of graphs and charts appeared. Over the past 12 months, we've seen a 30% decrease in racially biased stops. Complaints against officers related to racial profiling have dropped by 15%. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some nodded in approval, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Bennett continued, her tone measured. These numbers represent progress, but we recognize there's still work to be done. Marcus Davis stepped forward, his presence a reminder of the incident that had sparked this journey. He addressed the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces before him. Change doesn't happen overnight. We've laid a foundation, but sustaining this progress requires ongoing commitment from both the department and the community. He outlined the challenges they still faced. Resistance from some veteran officers continued to slow the implementation of new policies. Community trust, while improving, remained fragile. Each success was hard-won, each setback a reminder of the long road ahead. As Marcus spoke, Officer Chen listened intently from her seat in the third row. She thought back to the heated debates in the precinct, the long hours of training, the tense encounters that tested their new approach. It hadn't been easy, but she could see the difference in her daily interactions on the beat. Captain Bennett returned to the podium, her expression determined. Today, we're announcing the expansion of our reform programs to other precincts across the city. We believe the progress we've made here can serve as a model for broader change. The announcement sent a ripple of excitement through the room. Community leaders leaned forward, eager to hear more details. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, aware of the challenges that lay ahead. As the ceremony drew to a close, the atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. People lingered, engaged in animated discussions about the future of policing in their city. Marcus found himself surrounded by a mix of officers and community members, all eager to share their thoughts and concerns. Captain Bennett watched the scene unfold, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She knew the journey was far from over, but seeing the earnest conversations happening around her gave her hope. The road ahead would be challenging, but they had taken the first crucial steps towards building a more just and equitable system. As the crowd began to disperse, Bennett caught Marcus's eye across the room. They shared a nod of understanding, both acutely aware of the work that still lay ahead. The past year had been a testament to what could be achieved through determination and collaboration. Now they faced the task of ensuring those changes took root and flourished, transforming not just one precinct, but an entire city's approach to justice and community relations. The fight for justice in policing remained an ongoing challenge, even as progress had been made. While the 30% decrease in racially biased stops marked a significant improvement, deep-rooted issues persisted. Officers grappled with ingrained biases, and community trust remained fragile. Marcus Davis stood before a group of new recruits, his eyes scanning their eager faces. Vigilance is key, he emphasized, his voice carrying the weight of experience. We must constantly examine our actions and assumptions. He detailed the importance of continuous education and community engagement, stressing that reform was not a one-time event, but an ongoing process. As the session concluded, Marcus issued a call to action. Stay informed about local policing issues, he urged. Attend community meetings, engage with your local officials, and be part of the solution. The room buzzed with energy as the recruits filed out. many already discussing ways to get involved.